So welcome to the Dharma Study Group. Tonight we're going to be discussing the concept of the Brahmaviharas, which in English means the divine abodes of the heart, or the divine places to live in your heart. As I ring the bell and it goes to silence, we'll do the same. As we sit quietly, which we'll do for a couple of minutes more, I'll ask you now to inquire into what you imagine is the native experience of your heart when the mental habits fall away, or when the sky of your mind becomes more clear, the heart less cluttered. What might be the native qualities of your heart's expression? And if in response to such a question you have a silent answer, allow that to be the case. Sometimes the responses we get from the heart or the body don't have words. And you may join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. And with appreciation for your efforts to be here this evening, you may bow your head to your heart. Release both hands and open your eyes. So I'd be honored to hear from you if you had a response that included words as to the question, what might be the native qualities of your heart? What emerged for you? Yes?
I just saw a big, huge smile.
Mm-hmm. A big smile is a nice response. Yeah. What else emerged? Yes, Jessica? Open? Openness? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mushy and undefended, like unprotected.
Yeah. Mushy and undefended. Okay.
The sun, I feel like a sun.
Mm-hmm. And the sun, as an energetic force in the world, is unconditional and 360 degrees in every direction. Its radiance is, it's objective, unconditional. Mm-hmm. What else came to heart? Yes.
White as in snow, but it didn't feel cold, just really calm, peaceful.
Mm-hmm. Like a calm, peaceful quality. And you got the color white with that. Okay. Yeah. I often muse to myself about how philosophies and the stepping stones of yoga got written down, and how there must have been some direct experience as well as conversation amongst ancient yogis to determine that there are 4 divine qualities of the heart. There are 4 divine abodes of the heart. And to determine that there are 5 states of mind and 5 causes of suffering. And how did they come to these things? What were their hypotheses? How did they research it? And they did come to 4 divine qualities for the heart, according to the Yoga Sutras. In my study of Buddhism, there are actually 5, and I'll mention that the one that seems to be missing from the Yoga Sutras is called patience. And perhaps Patanjali feels he's already referenced that before he gets to this particular sutra in the particular series that he put these phrases together. Sutra means like suture, like a thread. So the one Yoga Sutra is threaded to the next Yoga Sutra. And he was implying along the way certain quality of mind. And he gets to this point in the Yoga Sutras where he says, if you're experiencing these particular obstacles, and there are 9 obstacles, they determined it down to 9 possible obstacles. If you're experiencing these obstacles, here are some possible remedies. I want to talk about the obstacles for a few minutes because I think they're worth understanding, that when you're experiencing the quote-unquote obstacles, you're experiencing the symptoms that are trying to get your attention to tell you there's another way to be present in your life, or to organize your routine, or to take care of your well-being, so that you could pursue and have the experience of yoga. So I'm going to give a little anecdote right now from one of my current students who was generous enough to email me in response after she had a one-to-one time with me earlier this week. So this particular student came, she's having symptoms that include migraines and vertigo and acid reflux and things that yoga would look at as vertically rising pitta. And she's in the pitta-vata transition in life. She's in perimenopause to menopause. And she's very keen on her own journey, and she takes insight and puts it into action, and she understands herself very well. She's highly intelligent that way and very integrated. So she left the appointment that we had and felt really well for a couple of days. And then she wrote me an email. And she had, for some reason, she had a purpose to interact with somebody she had ended a relationship with in the last couple of months. And she described the interpersonal dynamic between them and the difficulty of her decision to end this interpersonal relationship, to transition it to a new form, and in this case, moving towards no contact. But she then said, and my symptoms all flared up. And I'm trying not to judge myself or blame myself for this experience, but I'm wrestling with how to do that. So I bring this up because she had, for a couple of years, vacillation, which is one of the 9 obstacles. Do I stay or do I go? This famous music piece, do I stay or should I go? In this relationship, that was her vacillation. By the way, I recommend a book called Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay, if you have this same vacillation that she was facing. It was very well written. 10 questions to ask yourself. Too good to leave, too bad to stay. But she had this interpersonal vacillation, and then she had made a decision, and then she started experiencing the symptoms of restlessness and physical symptomology in her head and so on in her whole body, her whole system. So when she wrote me the email, what I heard was there's an interpersonal dilemma that's affecting her also intrapersonally. That means from her to her. She's trying not to judge, she's trying not to blame, but she's wrestling with how to do that best. So I recommended back to her the Brahmaviharas. Now that's a little new school to recommend the Brahmaviharas to her for her relationship with herself, because the Brahmaviharas were written for our relationship with others. So that's considered classical translation, and contemporary translation is we can use the Brahmaviharas for self and other, and also self to self. The obstacles that you face, whether they're physical symptoms or mental symptoms, the obstacles are telling you, you're going a little off track here. And so the obstacles include vacillation, like mental restlessness, doubt, like am I going in the right direction, lethargy, also called dullness sometimes, overindulgence. If you have a habit of overindulging, whether that's food or substance otherwise, or thought or activity, overindulging mental behaviors, that's all considered overindulgence. Assessing yourself as farther along on the path than you actually are.
That's one number.
That's one of them. Assessing yourself as farther along the path than you actually are. What that looks like is, in the addiction recovery model, it looks like a couple days of sobriety and then temptation, like, I'm doing so well, I can have a sip, or a bite, or I can go on the internet again. And then you misassessed yourself and ended up back in your particular compulsive or painful cycle. Also assessing yourself as not making progress, in other words, feeling like you're regressing. You might call the first one arrogance and the second one misperception, because you're misperceiving where you actually are. You might be making progress, but you don't see it or feel it.
I sometimes think of it as jet lag.
Yeah. So that sort of swirl of obstacles that we might experience, that gives you cause for questioning, am I going in a clear yogic direction here? How can I reassess my journey? And what Patanjali says at this point is, if you're having any one of these 9 obstacles, here, try these things. And the first thing he recommends is the Brahmaviharas. And they're interpersonal, even though those symptoms sound like they might be personal, like laziness, apathy, resignation, doubt, dullness, arrogance, feelings of disappointment. That sounds so personal. But he's giving an interpersonal recommendation. Isn't that curious?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're interpersonal as a species. As I've said before, we have social brains and we are not self-reliant. We're other-reliant. And even our awakening relies on other people. And also, our relationship to the quote-unquote other, or the otherness of the other, can really hold back our awakening. So your relationship to the otherness in that other person is where the Brahmaviharas point us. So the first of the 4 Brahmaviharas is called compassion, and spelled in Sanskrit as karuna.
Did you tell us the 9 obstacles, or did you not want to go?
Those were them.
6.
Oh, we'll read them later.
Okay. All right, well,
Let's see. Doubt, apathy, laziness, vacillation, resignation, arrogance, regression, overindulgence. I got you 8 of them, so you can read it later. Craving. Craving or grasping, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
disappointment is one of them.
Well, I use disappointment as you perceive yourself as regressing, so you're disappointed. Right? This is my contemporary translation. You perceive yourself as falling back on the path or as regressing. And you might say, I'm really disappointed in myself, I'm not making better progress. But if you saw yourself on occasion more objectively, the times when you feel like you're regressing might actually be times when you're leaning into a windstorm. And just that you're holding your ground is a good sign. When the wind lets up, you might realize, I've been strengthening myself, not regressing. So misperception is the actual translation of that one, but sometimes we call it perceiving that you're regressing. This is why it's so helpful to have a teacher who's objective for you to say, actually, I see you standing very steadily in a windstorm and holding your ground. So don't be disappointed. Let's not perceive you as regressing. Or a teacher can say, you've been vacillating on this question for a long time. Let's come to a decision. Then you can feel your anxiety about that. The teacher says, let's come to a decision. And she or he can help you navigate the anxiety about actually making a decision and not staying stuck in vacillation. The obstacles are also called hindrances, and they'll generally keep you stuck. Like craving, grasping, desire. But also falling into apathy, like resignation. Yeah, it's not worth it. The teacher in that case becomes like a lighthouse where you can remember, what is the value of all this effort I've been making on my yogic path or my awakening path? So if you're still facing the 9 hindrances or the 9 obstacles, and since you live an embodied life, you probably are facing them to some extent. Let me just ask, did anybody experience doubt anywhere along the way today? Mm-hmm. Did anybody feel like maybe a little apathetic about something in life today? Mm-hmm. Did anybody face craving? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How about misperception of yourself? Did you possibly encounter misperceiving yourself today? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is for those who are listening later on the recording. Everyone's nodding their head. You are not alone. Now, to what extent we're experiencing those things and what our relationship is to that experience, that's very important. Like you might have mild flushes of that material, and you might bring an attitude of compassion towards those flushes. And they're relatively innocuous. They're not really taking over. But if when you have a flush of one of those 9 hindrances, you also go into a kind of panic or a great annoyance with yourself, or you implode with frustration about yourself, that's problematic. So what happens with the Brahmaviharas is we hear there are 4 divine abodes, 4 efforts you can make towards the clear heart. They're also the 4 qualities of heart that are pulling you back home, like magnetically calling you back to your native heart, which is a phrase I got from my teacher Eknath Eswaran. When he says native heart means that which is most native to you. These qualities you'll see here tonight are the most native to who you are. However, the 9 hindrances get in the way and we forget who we are in our native heart, in our most natural state. So if you respond to yourself during those flushes with annoyance or impatience or cruelty or comparing yourself to somebody else and or to your past or future self, or you respond with a feeling of ill will or the urge for resentment, those are signs that you veered into what we call the near enemy and the far enemy. And I'll outline the near and far enemies in just a moment here, but I want to reference the last Dharma talk where we discussed Arjuna's journey, and across the field, those were considered the enemies, his cousins, and the 100 others were considered the enemies. And here in this discussion, we're going to say the near enemy and the far enemy. So what this implies is that those 100 others, those 100 ways in which the mind goes out of balance, causing us not to experience yoga, they threaten your awakening. They threaten to pull your life into adharma, means the absence of dharma. And here, what we are going to see about the 4 near enemies and the 4 far enemies is these are also threats to your heart's awakening. My recommendation is to use the Brahmaviharas to discover, to navigate the threats themselves. So compassion I put here with a line like this to divide the word passion from the root of the word come. Compassion, like community, communion, communication. The C-O-M there means with, to be with another, to communicate, to commune, to experience compassion, to commiserate. So, and the word passion means to suffer. Like the movie that I went to way back in art school called The Passion of Christ. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah, and the suffering. So the word compassion translated from those 2 roots actually means to suffer with. And the way that I like to translate it is that your heart's ability to quiver with the heart of another when suffering is present, that's called compassion. And the reason I use the word quiver is because sometimes it feels like your heart's quivering, like a tiny sensitive bird when you feel the suffering of another. You're resonating with something in them that's stirring your own responsibility to suffering. So compassion implies a willingness to be with, not an urge to change it or to manipulate it or to push it away or to dampen it or to escape it. I've used this analogy before and I'll use it again right now because it's apt for whenever I talk about compassion. There is an Indian instrument called the esraj, and my friend Benji Wertheimer plays this instrument. Does anybody know the instrument itself?
Is it the one that you rest on your forehead?
I don't think his forehead is on it, he's too tall. But is there anybody who's seen the instrument, this Indian instrument?
This is the long guitar like music.
Yeah, it's going up and down this way, right? So it has a small gourd and then it has a long neck, and the way the esraj is put together, there are vertical strings going up and down, and there are horizontal strings behind those vertical strings. So when Benji plays the esraj, which is like a sitting down Indian violin, he's playing the strings that are vertical, and the strings behind those strings are vibrating. That's why it has such a bigger tone than you would get from just a stringed instrument. It sounds like there's more going on than one instrument. Those strings behind the vertical strings are called sympathetic strings. I'm going to call them empathetic strings because in a moment I'm going to talk about how we translate the word sympathy culturally speaking. But the quality of compassion is like the quality of empathy. So when the vertical strings get played, the horizontal strings empathize and they vibrate. So when you're in the presence of someone else's suffering, if you've been courageous enough to feel your own suffering, your heart will likely vibrate with theirs. And likewise, when you touch into a place in yourself, an aspect of you that's suffering, a more wise aspect or a more grounded aspect in you can vibrate with that, can hold the space for it to happen. That suffering can be sacred, kind of holy, not always a disappointment or something to escape or dampen down. So That is to say, I'm dividing you into parts right now when I say an aspect of you might be experiencing suffering, and another aspect comes through with wisdom or compassion, or the ability to hold space for that experience. When I divide you into parts, does that feel uncomfortable? You're not concerned about me? Thinking of you as having different parts? You experience yourself that way, right? Yeah, so it's not too far off. I was trained in the inner community model in my art therapy training, and yet I was also trained in mental health, where if people had different voices, we were concerned about them. But we all have aspects, or you can call them parts, like inner community members. The inner community member in you whose experience of suffering is frightening for her or for him, and the inner community member in you whose experience of suffering makes them empathize, makes them feel compassion. And those two can come together to help each other. Do you understand what I mean? So compassion, meaning to suffer with the heart of another when suffering is present, also means to be willing to be with your own considerate pain when it's present. But the near enemy, and the near enemy in this case means like a little bit the disguise, the impersonation of, the attempt to be compassion. So the near enemy of karuna is sympathy or pity. So in our culture, when we look at the word sympathy, we imply a kind of hierarchy. Like, I'm sympathizing with you from where I stand, a little bit aloof or a little bit above, and I'm sympathizing with your pain and suffering. To add pity to that is to say, I also hope I don't experience what you're experiencing. I hope that stays with you and doesn't cross over to me. I hope I don't catch it. So we can avert our gaze to the homeless person or the begging person or the person in pain. We might avert our ears or avert our minds and hearts away from. We may say sympathetic things, but we may be feeling pity. So the near enemy, because it implies a kind of hierarchy, isn't considered the divine abode of your heart. It's close. And if you catch yourself experiencing pity, you can nudge yourself towards compassion. If you miss that you're experiencing pity or sympathy, you might fall into the far enemy. If your own life gets really out of balance, and or if this suffering thing within or near you is big enough, you might fall into the far enemy, which is called cruelty. So some of you have known each other for a while, several years. Some have known each other for a couple of months. Has anybody experienced cruelty from oneself to oneself? Mm-hmm. It might sound like a raging inner critic or an inner dictator, or the inner oppressor, I sometimes call it. Do you have names for yours?
Names that our far self calls us, or names for it?
Names for it. Names. Well, I call that far enemy in myself or in others, the inner critic, the inner dictator, the inner oppressor, the inner judge, the inner taskmaster, the ruthless, ongoing voice that says not good enough and never good enough, and or it says flawed and broken and pathetic. I've had a lot of experience with my inner cruelty towards myself. I haven't had it much towards others. I think I occupied it mostly with myself. Fortunately, I exhausted it in the process of recovering back to the Brahmaviharas. But do you have names for yours? Would you be willing to say what it is?
Well, taskmaster.
Mm-hmm.
Taskmaster. No, actually, excuse me, it's not taskmaster, it's task mistress.
And if
She makes me go in circles,
uh-huh.
and I can't stop until I collapse.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say going in circles where you can't stop until you collapse is exhausting and unkind.
Yeah, it's cruel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Please talk to her. Tell her to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about that in just a few moments. What do we do? Do you have other names for it?
Mine is often the what if, the worrying person. I don't really have a name for it, but it's often this surge of worry that's very hard for me that it's all going to go, if I'm to think about how it's going to go, it's the worst way it can go, and in all of its forms, and it's very hard to pull myself out of that when that happens. When I do look at it twice.
Yes, I understood what you said. Yes, Jerome?
Call it the wounding one.
The wounded, wounding one. That's a good perspective. Right. Yeah.
I have a friend that calls it her itty bitty shitty committee.
It's amazing.
I don't think I've heard that before. So the itty bitty shitty committee. Yeah. Except that the power of it is not always so itty bitty, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were to consider what it would be like to have, rather than an ongoing inner critic, an ongoing inner sense of self-compassion, what might that look like? And what do you think the liabilities would be?
Mayhem.
There would be mayhem?
You have to give up what's familiar.
You do have to give up what's been familiar. If your inner critic, your inner condemner has been there active for quite some time, and you're going to transition from cruelty to compassion towards yourself, you'd have to give up what's been familiarized. It wasn't your basic state when you were born, it wasn't your native heart, but it got familiarized. And if you're going to change, you'll be in new ground that is actually also like coming home. What are the other liabilities?
Stop to function in this society.
You might stop functioning according to society. Is that what you said? Yeah. Yes?
You might achieve some of those dreams or wishes that you potentially had instead of seeing vacillation.
Yeah. Like you might actually move forward and progress and achieve dreams that you've had rather than getting stuck in vacillation. Or getting stuck in the constant recovery from the inner critic's voice and her narrative or his narrative about you, which is pretty tiresome. What are the other liabilities? Do you ever think, I might not get anything done?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Lose your motivation.
lose motivation?
Yeah, lose your motivation.
Mhm.
Like somehow the committee is like motivating you to like do all these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I suspect that that's highly culturally conditioned for us, and it has some of its roots in the Puritan work ethic in our community, and other roots in shame as motivation. And shame isn't motivating. In fact, your neurological system, your nervous system alone, does not want to be motivated by shame because it's actually terrified at the same time. So its motivation is like a short-term burst of activity in a certain direction to get out of harm's way. But under that dictatorship, the decisions you make will likely be the same short-term decisions you made before, producing the same long-term complications you've been living with. Did you follow what I said there?
So we're doing stuff to get away from, we're not motivated by shame, but we're motivated to get away from...
No, what I'm saying is that we suspect that shame could be motivating. So our culture has tried to use shame to motivate. That was a parenting style when I was a kid. So I was on the receiving end of that as a parenting and as an educational style too. Even though I was a straight-A student, we still had shame as a motivator in the classroom. So if we misperceive that shame is going to be motivating, when we shame ourselves to motivate, when we think that's going to work, your nervous system actually won't abide by that except for a long-term complication of repeated short-term decisions to try to alleviate the shame. So you shame yourself for motivation, you make a short-term decision like, what I'm going to do is get my to-do list accomplished. And then you just repeat the same behavior of accomplishing your to-do list, creating the same complicated outcome that's long-term exhaustion. This is one example. Or shame tells you, if you go to compassion, there's going to be all-out mayhem. And shame feels more threatening than compassion, so instead of allowing compassion, we go to the shame voice and say, okay, I will clean the house, I will organize the schedule, I will get things put together, I will prevent mayhem in every way that I can, and I'll do it based on what I know, which means I'll repeat the same short-term decisions I've been making to have the same long-term outcome of not being so happy with my life. Because those decisions prevent spontaneity, and they don't want you to lean into the unknown or to take risks to live more in compassion and equanimity. Do you understand what I'm pointing to there? You follow? Nancy?
Might be going in another direction, so I don't know if there's more you want to say here.
Go ahead.
So another liability that I could see if one backs off of cruelty towards oneself or others is increased heartbreak.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The heart becomes more tender, and we could call that a liability, but the perception of that as a liability is from this side of the mountain. And on the other side of the mountain, the perception of that is that it's a great asset. To have the heart be that tender and expansive and willing. Because the fundamental quandary for human lives is that they're very precious and temporary, and that we know it. All life is precious and temporary, but my garden plants don't know it about themselves, and neither do my cats. And they don't think all life is precious, actually they think their own lives are the most precious. I mean, just the cat species in general. But you understand, they don't know how short-term their lives are. And we do. We get to face that quandary. And that's cause for tenderheartedness. Yeah. So if we turned towards compassion as an intrapersonal relationship, like from us to us, the great gains for self-compassion far outnumber the liabilities of shame. But shame is very powerful as a morphogenic energy, and it's like a collective undertow in human nature. Partly because the right brain, which is what you're born with, your right hemisphere is available when you're born and is dominant for the first 1.5 to 2 years of your life. And the right brain, its inclination is to listen for shame and anxiety and for the darker aspects of humankind, because it's watching out for threat to your survival. So not just that shame is implicit to that part of your brain, but it's also then generation to generation been passed down. So it's a lineage, as it were. That's not to say that we should be abiding by the messages of shame, but we should be aware how powerful an undertow it can feel like. And of course the brain keeps developing, so we don't have to live with what we're born with from infancy to 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years old. We can grow into more mature experiences, more integrated left and right brain together, and more aware of what your heart's capacity is too. But just know it's such a strong undertow. For example, until recent generations, people who were left-handed were considered frightening because of their connection to the right brain. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. They were considered like devilish or frightening. They weren't comfortable around left-handed individuals. And in fact, some of you who might have been left-handed at birth, if you grew up in a certain school system, you're right-handed now.
They tied your hand behind your back for my aunt from when she was left-handed to make her use
They made her be a right-handed individual. And it's a right-handed world we live in. You may not notice it if you're right-handed, but if you've ever had to have your right hand in a cast, you've noticed this is a right-handed world. Oh. Jessica, were you left-handed and now you're right-handed? No. Okay.
I just heard about that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
My sister was left-handed, is left-handed, and it also was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck.
Oh.
And so she's smarter than everybody else and more intuitive. I mean, this is her perception of herself. But she convinced us all when we were little that people who were left-handed were born with the umbilical cord around their neck, which meant that they were somehow gifted. Anyway, there's probably sorry, that was so off topic, I'm sorry.
Well, it does speak to the way as children we have to form a perception of the world and ourselves so that it makes sense. And that's the other thing that can happen, where if shame is an implicit capacity that your brain has, if you're born into a circumstance that you can't explain otherwise, you might start thinking things like, it must be about me. This chaos or despair or depression or anger or alcoholism or illness in the family or sorrow or ambivalence or apprehension, it must be something about me. Now, you don't have the sentence formed in your head, you don't have that much cognition, but you can internalize a felt sense that this environmental ambiance, including other people, that doesn't seem like so super harmonious, must be about me. And if that environmental ambiance lights up and becomes jubilant because you smile or laugh or have like a little baby moment, you can think also, it's about me. Look, it happened. It worked. So there is an orientation and a fundamental orientation for the infant to be self-centered. And there's also a fundamental hormonal surge for the parents to be infant-centered. This is just part of our evolution, so we can survive. But one of the quandaries we face there is that children are picking up on everything in their environment and trying to find the narrative that makes sense. And sometimes that narrative has been lasting for so long that your basic undercurrent is shame. Something is wrong with me. And the undercurrent of, let me respond to that with compassion and self-kindness and tenderness, that undercurrent may be like just a trickle of a suggestion, which I hope to widen by having you here tonight. And to say that responding to yourself with compassion or tenderness and kindness, the difference to your nervous system is so great that the possibility of your actual heart as an innervated organ returning to compassion is much greater. These aren't just important life values. I also want you to experience them viscerally, like neurologically, fundamentally, physiologically. So compassion as a body-centered state is now studied as part of your vagus nerve, which I've talked about a lot, so pardon me for repeating myself, but the vagus nerve is also called the nerve of compassion or altruism. And it innervates so many functions in your body that for tonight's discussion, what's important to hear is that it innervates your heart, your actual physical heart. It also innervates your lungs and your diaphragm and partners with supporting your colon and your GI system and so on, and your pharynx and your larynx and facial muscles, and yet it innervates your heart. So when we take in these values first as concepts, perhaps, because maybe they feel distant or unlivable, so we might hear a concept and we try it on, and then you internalize it more and more, and it seeps in and consistently may become deeper and deeper. You can make the new undercurrent in your life be about self-compassion rather than shame. You can also generate that possibility by breathing well to regulate your vagus nerve. So, for example, if you value compassion but you're hyperventilating, and somebody says, well, how about some self-compassion? Do you think it's going to be effective at that moment? It's really hard if the physiological system is saying, no, panic, there's a threat to my survival, take care of my survival. It's hard to hear, well, use compassion for your survival. Because under threat, your system is going to emergency responses, and one of those might be defend, protect, fight back, shut down, immobilize. And somebody suggesting compassion, it can seem like that's not going to work very well right now. And yet, compassion as a response to perceived threat could tenderize your heart. Now, it's easier if you practice compassion on a regular basis so that when something does come up that feels like an emergency, you have some tools on board. So let's put a couple synonyms up here for self-compassion, how you might respond to yourself, how you might practice that from you to you.
Spontaneity.
I'm not sure how that fits.
So ask the question again.
What are some synonyms for the quality of self-compassion that you could practice from you to you? I've said a couple tonight. I'm going to write them down so I can jog your memory. Tenderness. Kindness. Empathy.
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness, yeah.
Love.
Did you say love?
Yeah.
Reassurance.
Mm-hmm.
Patience.
Patience. Mm-hmm.
Encouragement.
Mm-hmm. Yes, encouragement is interesting because encouragement, core, is the root word for the word heart. Encouragement. And Jerome, what were you going to say?
Well, like would befriendness be one?
Yes.
That's a word.
Can I say befriending?
Befriending,
Yeah, one of my favorites. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question to consider for a few moments here. And if you're someone who considers best with your eyes closed and your ears open, feel free to do that. The words we have on the board include patience, tenderness, kindness, empathy, encouragement, forgiveness, love, reassurance, and befriending. And if you could consider maybe a vulnerable aspect of yourself or an aspect that often feels is under the siege of threat of shame, you can bring one of those aspects to mind. And consider the possibility of responding to that aspect in you with kindness or with tenderness, with patience, with empathy, with forgiveness, with befriending. And as you consider that, notice how your nervous system and your heart rate and your breathing respond. And imagine now that the next time that the inner critic or the inner condemner might arise, you would have a phrase you could say to ward off shame and promote compassion. You might say, for example, to this inner critic, "Not right now. I'm practicing tenderness towards my vulnerability." Or, "Not right now. I'm practicing forgiveness towards myself when I make a mistake." Or, "Not right now. I'm practicing empathy towards the parts of me that are frightened." So if you were to generate a phrase that you might use, I'm going to ask you to consider what might that be, and if you have pen and paper and you'd like to write it down, I would encourage you to do so. And it would be very helpful if there's a few of you who'd be willing to say what your phrase might be. I offered some examples from personal experience, but if there are a few of you who might use a phrase and you're willing to say it, it could benefit somebody else in the room. Did you get one? Okay.
I said, it will come. I'm practicing patience with myself.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying to this inner dictator, for example, "It will come. Like, don't bother me right now. I'm practicing patience with myself." Yeah. Maybe you're talking to the part of you that wants urgency.
Yes. Answers.
Urgency is a way to be cruel to yourself. So you say, "It will come. Right now I'm practicing patience with myself." Yeah. Tristan, did you get one there?
I liked the not right now because I guess I feel like I'm all over the place. But I liked thinking of not right now, and then I'm trying to practice, and then just using one of these many words, any of them. The first ones that came to mind were kindness and patience. So.
Yeah. So when we say not right now, I'm trying to practice kindness or patience or any other thing, it can actually be really helpful to also add towards what about yourself. Because shame is very slippery, and it will decide that, fine, you're going to practice kindness towards the part of you that's frightened, but what about the part of you that's angry? Or the part of you that's pathetic? And so you need to have a few phrases or a way to make the sentence complete. This is a strategy, like a cognitive strategy to help the emotional undertow. So I'll recommend that sort of phrasing for you. And Jessica?
I like the not right now as well, and then just I'm practicing tenderness with myself when I take something personally.
That's great. So that's good also how she's really specific. So I would recommend you get some specificity online because, as I was saying, shame is very slippery. If it's not one thing, it's another, as they say. That's shame's perspective, and it'll keep you going with that taskmaster, and things will feel urgent, or that the world's going to fall apart, as you were saying about the what if story. Right? So this is, I think, the primary Brahmavihara for most people here in the West, is to learn this quality of self-compassion. And I'm going to give you the other Brahmaviharas because they're also very powerful and helpful. And the second one that we talk about in Sanskrit is called Maitri, but in Buddhism it's called Metta. And it means loving kindness. So loving kindness is usually offered as a prayer to help liberate yourself. In fact, each of these practices as an interpersonal dynamic is to liberate your own heart from holding on to things like resentment, desire, attachment, greed, envy, ill will, cruelty. Loving kindness very specifically is to help free us and our hearts from the attachment to our worldview that things would be different. The near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. And what that means is, let's say you're going to practice loving kindness. I wish for this person to be free from unnecessary suffering. I wish for this person to experience joy and peace. I wish for this person harmony and love and liberation. If they would just live according to my values. So that's how attachment shows up. You might be practicing the quality of, like the impersonation of loving kindness, but you actually have more than a seed of attachment as to how this is going to turn out. Loving kindness is intended to free us from that experience of attachment. While it's practiced towards people in general, the most challenging of this practice is directed at someone who's caused you harm or caused harm to somebody else. So we generally warm up with loving kindness towards someone who's been a benefactor to us or who's been benevolent in our direction. Someone with whom you felt you were cared for, and there was warmth and nurturance, and you can say to that person, if they're no longer here and you don't have verbal access, you might even you say it internally. Thank you. I wish for this person, let's say my grandmother or my grandfather or this teacher in your life, I wish for them to have peace and joy and to be free from unnecessary suffering. May they experience harmony and love. And your heart could have swelled a little bit like the Grinch, a little bit bigger. And you might practice this on someone who's relatively neutral in your world, like the postman or the traffic people who are repairing the road, and you drive by and you see, I don't know this person very well, it's an anonymous face, but may you be free from unnecessary suffering. May you experience peace and joy. May you know love and harmony, and your heart gets, again, a little bit bigger, like the Grinch. Less Grinchy. And then you try practicing on someone with whom you've experienced difficulty, pain, conflict, harm. And at first you might feel the heart get smaller, like, I'm practicing this, but if I'm practicing this, I hope you're going to change your behavior. That's why the near enemy is called attachment. And the far enemy is ill will. So to practice loving kindness towards someone for whom you've actually had the urge for ill will, that's a very high practice. Now, let me ask, has shame ever promoted for you the experience of ill will towards yourself? Like, I hope you suffer, you deserve it. You're so pathetic, and so on. You've heard this voice in your head? Yeah. So I just said that practicing loving kindness towards someone who's caused harm to you, or for whom you've had the urge for ill will, that's the highest practice that there is. So we're going to practice.
What did you say the near enemy was of me?
Attachment. The near enemy is attachment. Like, I'm willing to practice this meditation as long as the world shows up according to my desires. As in, this other person starts behaving in a way that I want them to behave. Like, they learn from their lessons. They learn from the causes, the harm they've caused. We've practiced loving kindness. This was a few years back, but we were practicing in a meditation retreat. And we went from the benefactor to the neutral person and intimate, and then we went out into the world. And we were in a big group setting, and you could call out a name of a person, and somebody said, George Bush. And you could feel the room just like, no. No, not him. But then you could also feel when we actually practiced in his direction, like it was so powerful to practice towards someone who you consider has caused harm of some kind. It's not condoning their behavior. To practice this loving kindness meditation towards your shame monster is not saying that you think shame is worthy of loving kindness. You're not condoning behavior of a person who's caused harm. You're liberating your own heart. It's to free you up, not to agree with behavior in the other person. To understand that distinction is very important. Okay, so I'd like you to sit comfortably for a few moments, or you can lie if it's more suited to you and you're not going to fall asleep. And if you concentrate better with your eyes closed, you're welcome to do that. I'd like you to visualize that you have an inner community, that there are inner aspects or parts of yourself, and that one of those inner community members is so benevolent and kind with you. She might be, or he might be, that aspect that's nurturing, that says, there, let's have a hot bath. She might be that aspect that says, you really did your best, and everything is fine. Or she might be that aspect, or he might be that part of yourself that you can lean on when you experience sorrow. So towards this aspect of yourself that is your inner benefactor, you may say to him or to her, thank you. May you be free from unnecessary suffering and pain. Thank you. May you know peace and joy. Thank you. May you experience love and harmony. May you be free from unnecessary suffering and pain. Thank you. Notice how your heart and your body respond, and how your inner benefactor responds as well. And then I'd like you to bring to mind a person who's neutral in your life and like an actual person. the road worker, the postman, somebody at the tea shop, a person who walks their dog in your neighborhood. And as you bring this person to mind, see for a moment their simple humanity and the part of them in their humanity that you also share. And from your own heart towards theirs, you can say, "Thank you. May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. Thank you. May you know peace and joy. Thank you. May you know love and harmony. Thank you. May you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. And notice how your heart responds in offering this prayer to a neutral person. And then coming back into your own inner community, bring to mind an aspect of yourself that is sometimes tyrannical and maybe imposes ill will and might even cause you harm. Maybe it's the tyrannical part of you that eats too much or watches too much TV or misses your bedtime or gets frustrated and has email marathons. Or the part that keeps you suppressed and hidden away from your own dreams. And because this aspect of you offers a chance for you to liberate your heart, we say to it also, "Thank you. May you be free from unnecessary suffering and pain. To the part of you that sometimes causes harm to yourself, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy. To the part of you that causes harm to yourself, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know love and harmony. To that part of you that is sometimes tyrannical and causes pain or harm from you to you, you may say again, may you be free from unnecessary pain and suffering. May you know peace and joy and love and harmony. May you be free. Notice how your heart and your body respond to that prayer. When you're ready to do so, you may quietly open your eyes. And if you are lying down, you may return to sitting as well. Or come to slumber party pose where we get to see you. I would be honored to hear a bit of your experience. I can tell you that my own journey out of self-harm heavily relied on the practice of Maitri or loving kindness meditation towards myself. Yes?
When we got to the last one, I started thinking of a TV show I was watching earlier today. Like I noticed I was doing everything I could not to think of and not to accept the loving kindness or kind self-talk that you were trying to get us to do. I was all of a sudden in the midst of this plot of a TV show that had nothing to do with it. So it just goes to show how much you'll resist it when it comes to your own. When it was someone else, it was really easy. But when it came to doing the kindness towards the parts of me that I don't like, it was not so easy.
Yeah, and a distraction showed up immediately. Yeah. And if you consider that sometimes shame is actually inserting those distractions so it can stay employed, this is a helpful way to look at it, because this, shame could be, this is what my friends used to say, and this is not meant to be derogatory towards musicians, but I was in a circumstance where this made a lot of sense. They'd say to me, Sarah Joy, what is a musician without a girlfriend? Homeless. So I was thinking of how sometimes we have to consider that shame wants to stay employed and it needs a place to live. So we practice loving kindness towards this part of yourself that sometimes causes harm, and a distraction shows up in the form of like one of shame's magic tricks. Here's a distraction. Yada yada da 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 da. And shame gets to stay employed and still has a place to live. That is in your own mind. So thank you for that, for saying. It's very helpful. Yes?
I kind of, I lost you halfway through, because I've come across this again and again and again, which is that I, for the life of me, when it's like words or me thinking thoughts in my head, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me at all. So much of my movement practice is that I regress to a place where there's no words, no narrative, no thoughts, nothing. And sometimes I think the sensation of feeling loving kindness to me is my shoulder blades soften in the back, and it opens up the heart opens up in the back. The front is exaggerated sometimes like this, but when the back softens, that's what it feels like for me. And sometimes I find if I'm doing my own movement practice, if a thought of someone or something comes to mind and my back softens, that's for me, that's the mantra, or that's the meditation. And so that was just kind of my experience, was that it was difficult for me to follow the words. But then I just started trying to be more in my body and just stay there at least, and feeling sensations in my fingertips and across my stomach felt warm, holding, doughy, kneading a ball of dough or something, and it felt really warm and lovely. And to me that was just kind of my nonverbal experience of that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think you can take refuge in that. Let that be nourishing. And I would also recommend, if you could see yourself as getting nourished in that nonverbal way, that you could also imagine the possibility of growing that into linguistic capacity, because it will serve you as an adult helping children and helping others along the way. And our brain does develop language, and cognition is a part of the blessing of being a human. So I want to honor that pre-verbal body-centered experience for you, and it's very strongly developed. So maybe the less developed parts of any of us can start to find their way to expression as well.
I think for me it's more that I can feel myself regressing to an earlier time, a really, really, really early time, and I just need to be there right now. Yes, and what I'm saying back to you as your teacher and a person sitting out here more objectively isn't denying that. Yeah. But it's saying there's a life spectrum.
And I would be remiss if I said only, that's so wonderful, and didn't also say, and in your life spectrum, you may need the skill of bringing this into more adult parts of who you are, where there's language and cognition, because you want to be of service to others as well.
Yeah.
And some of them will need to hear it in words, and to feel it in this relationship also. So don't deny what's happening beautifully now, but let's leave the door open for the other aspects to evolve as well. Mhm. Yeah. Yes?
So the word practicing is really handy,
Mhm.
because it's really a compassionate word. I'm not there. I'll never be there. I'm practicing. So but I mean, it seems like a wonderful antidote to shame.
Yes. Well, it points to the fact that we're evolving and that we're in process. Shame likes things to be, well, shame will tell you that there is perfection as a possibility, but your inner perfectionist is unrealistic and unreasonable. So if you're in process instead of having to be perfect, that's a better lens to look through, a more warm-hearted lens to look through. I'm the time manager for tonight too, so I want to come over here where I didn't hear from anybody. Is there somebody who'd like to say about your experience? I'm wondering if Vigo would be willing to say something. And the answer might be no, which is okay. Okay, yeah. I just didn't want you to go unseen or unacknowledged right now. Thank you. So here we are, Patanjali suggesting these practices. There are two more. So the next one is called mudita, which is a word I love to say. I'll spell it for you. Mudita means happiness for other people's happiness. It means appreciative joy, like appreciating the joy in them, whatever means they used to get there.
Can you say that again?
Appreciative joy, happiness for their happiness, whatever means they used to get there. So I tell this story often, and I'm going to tell it to you right now because it's relevant, it's easy for me to tell it, and I think people have responded well to it over the years. I live in a particular neighborhood on a dead end, and we have a really, might I say, elegant, well-developed, lovely garden. And we've spent time creating our garden without chemicals and with a lot of finger pulling for the weeds. And we live on a dead end without sidewalks. It's an unfinished Portland road. And to get to our house, you have to go by the neighbor's house because we're further in on the dead end than he is. And this particular neighbor that I'm referring to has also a beautiful garden. His is in the front of his house and ours is in the back. And every so often I'm riding my bike home and I'd ride by his house and the chemical truck is visiting to spray his garden. He's a few houses down from our house, and I see that chemical truck and I cringe. And I dislike my neighbor for a few moments or longer. I don't like his value system to use chemicals on his garden. And other times when I'm riding my bike from my house to the studio and back, and I think, oh, I'm saving some resources on the planet here. Like, what a good person I am. I see him washing his car even though it's about to rain. I see him washing his truck, and it just rained yesterday, and he's out there buffing it and cleaning it. I think, oh, and the hose is running and running. And the way the hose runs in our neighborhood, he's a little uphill from us, so it's going down. You can see all the water, and oh gosh, so painful. I have my other cringe about my neighbor. My neighbor doesn't know I have these cringes. I haven't spoken to him about it. But the cringe is a cost to me. I'm not changing his behavior by cringing about it. And I don't have a personal agenda with this neighbor to go change his behavior. Because actually I see the happiness that comes out of these activities for him. And I also know something about his personal life story and the sorrows that are there. And I can't change those either for him. That we don't have enough relationship for that. I have enough relationships to navigate already in my life. But the point of this particular story is he's finding some happiness in those particular means. And really not much else right now. Because of, as I said, the story in his life. And I don't mean story like he made it up. I mean the actual events of his life. So recognizing that there's enough sorrow and there's these whims of happiness in him, my cringe is only costing me happiness. It's not costing him anything when I ride my bike by like that. So the practice of mudita is the practice of not cringing in response to how somebody else comes to their happiness, how they come to their joy or their appreciation in life. I used to cringe when people had to go to happy hour to feel happy. It's like, oh, why do you need substances to feel happy? I feel like all like sort of arrogant. Just do yoga. It's my inner New Yorker. Oh. But now I see people finding some happiness in community, and it might be temporary. It might be, from my perspective, like superficial, but I don't know. I'm not in there in the happy hour bar. It's too crowded and noisy for me. But they're looking for happiness. So mudita implies that we're appreciating the joy somebody else is experiencing because they have a longing for joy. It's a little bit like non-judgment, non-cringing. And even bigger than that, that we appreciate when people have blessings that we might envy, that we're able to say, wow, they're a person who's like naturally graceful in their life, or they're a person who's gotten a lot of positive input, or they're a person who's somehow naturally fallen into good positions and they can help other people, or we see their life is amazing, and we might be prone to comparison or envy, but instead we can be happy for the blessings in their life. So there's these two aspects, non-cringing and celebrating. And Nancy, you're going to say something there?
Wait, this one's a tough one.
Yeah.
I feel like the second one I can get behind.
Yeah. It's easier.
Much easier. And so what comes to mind, and I'm sure this is my own obstacle, like even as I'm going to say this, but I somehow need to justify it.
Okay.
So I'm going to say it out loud, and then we can help me out.
Go for it.
So everyone help. So what if you do have a relationship with someone enough to know that the way in which they're seeking happiness is actually empty?
Mm-hmm.
That is actually not, I know it sounds judgmental, and as I'm saying the words,
Mm-hmm.
that is either, it's clearly based in a hurt, or it's based in a past experience of trying to escape something or distract oneself from something or not face something.
Yeah.
That's the non-cringing struggle I have.
Mm-hmm. My personal experience, both with my own life and watching other lives, is if we're going to address something like that with a person and we come to it with our cringe intact, we're probably not going to get that much traction. And yet if we come to it without the cringe, something more kind might come through us. Something that's really appreciating their longing for happiness, that we can connect at that basic need and celebrate that together. But if we come with agenda and cringe and desire to actually change them, we may not get where we're going. Where we'd like to go, I should say it that way. We may not get where we'd like to go.
It's like the quote
and you might actually, go ahead.
It's like the quote in your bathroom about the advice falling.
Yes.
What is it?
The quote in our bathroom says about when advice is falling softly, it can become more effective. Well, but if we come with that primary sense, like, I really celebrate that you long for happiness or contentment or ease or joy, I so get that. And we're not cringing one bit about how they get there. That's why we practice to lessen the cringe before addressing it. Jolene?
I like the phrase, just like me. Just like me, you want to be happy.
Yeah.
It sort of levels something in that, and it doesn't require me to like those choices.
Yeah, it can neutralize in a way.
But just like me.
Yes.
Just like me, you want to feel connected, or just like me, you want to.
Just like me, you need some relief.
Yeah.
And maybe this person is getting relief but not happiness, if you're calling it emptiness. Sometimes I look at that, they're getting relief somehow. And boy, I crave relief too.
Yeah.
And you were going to say, Lynn?
I really appreciate what you said about, you're going to say it anyways, even though, anyways. And what I feel with those kind of sentences is I totally get why that is helpful, but I see myself practicing that and it seems fake. Being like, oh yeah, I totally get that you want to be happy and that's why you drinking every night.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that all the way over here.
Yeah, so she got that from yards away. Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder where we find, and if we find genuineness there,
Mm-hmm.
if it's not there in the moment when you quit, when you drive by your neighbor.
Right, right. Now, sometimes you might be applying one of these Brahmaviharas, and another one would be more beneficial to you. For example, when you make the gesture you just made there, which we'll spare the internet folks from, which was delightful here, but describing it is not as helpful. But when you make that gesture that's really angry, frustrated, overwhelmed, bewildered, when it's all that, the Brahmavihara that would be recommended is equanimity, upekshanam. And it looks like this. So if you put it together, I'll draw it up here for you so you can understand. And I realize I only have space for these three right now. This means equanimity. So we saw compassion earlier. This means appreciative joy. Now the near enemy of appreciative joy is comparison. And the far enemy is envy. Well, the near enemy of equanimity is, the far enemy is greed and rage. And the near enemy is detachment and aversion. So you're experiencing aversion towards something that this person is doing to themselves, which is also affecting you. And in the Brahmaviharas, the interpersonal practice here would be, I'm in aversion, and sometimes I actually feel all outrage about this. So you direct it back to which of these Brahmaviharas might be the most helpful for you to liberate yourself. In this case, upekshana means equanimity, and equanimity, I translate equanimity like this. Pardon me, Webster. Or Wikipedia, or whatever you use to look up your words. But I translate equanimity to mean a quality of porousness of heart that allows life to happen through and with you while you stay buoyant. You're not flooded, you're not capsized, you're not escaping to the moon and back, you're not fighting, you're not overwhelmed. It's a quality of porousness, though, that we get to participate in life. It's happening with, through, and around us, and we're buoyant. We're not capsized. That's how I define equanimity. So if aversion is going to take my ship down, I'm going to lose my equanimity, and then I'm going to talk to somebody about how badly they're behaving towards themselves or towards me. I'm probably going to end up in some conflict. So we practice the Brahmavihara associated with our particular near or far enemy. So up here you can see loving kindness, the attachment is the near enemy. Kind of like attachment or agenda. And the far enemy to loving kindness was ill will. And the near enemy up above for compassion was sympathy or pity. And the far enemy was cruelty.
So for mudita, what was the near enemy?
The near enemy is comparison.
Oh, comparison.
For mudita, and the far enemy is envy. So let's just take Lynn's honesty and Nancy's honesty also about this. And what I heard from you is that you go to aversion and then maybe some rage. And I didn't hear you say this, but let's fantasize that rage could then turn to the urge for cruelty or ill will. So if you went to practicing equanimity, like the evenness, the porousness, but it wasn't working, and you say, oh my God, it's not working, this meditation practice sucks. And you have to decide for yourself, am I going now more towards cruelty to the other person or urges for ill will? Well, then I have to practice compassion or maitri, loving kindness. So you're looking for your way out of the dilemma that you're creating for yourself. Yes.
Can I push again on mudita?
Yes.
So can I just take this out of the intrapersonal and the interpersonal?
Yes.
And I look at it globally?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So I think, for example, of the United States as a practice, that we do many things that are unethical, that lack
Yes.
integrity, to fill an emptiness and call it happiness or comfort.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it's really hard for me to be excited about that and to not cringe about that.
I wouldn't recommend that you're excited about that.
I'm not.
It doesn't line up with your life values.
Not
No.
in the least.
No, it doesn't. However, to see like the inclination for the human, the vulnerable, overwhelmed, precious, less than wise human, to seek happiness somehow, we can appreciate that. That's why it's called appreciative joy. I can appreciate that in that person. Now, appreciative joy is like let's call the country of Bhutan a place to practice. And I can really celebrate how they experience happiness. And happiness is their gross national byproduct, or whatever they say. Gross national happiness is more interesting to them than gross national product, right? So you might choose a country where you can really celebrate that's happening there. And yet the seed in the American and the seed in the Bhutanese people, the fundamental underlying seeds are the same. We've just gotten lost, distracted, distorted, fractured, greedy. So you might identify what's going on in the Western mind and start practicing towards that.
Except that, unlike Bhutan, we manufacture a global image of happiness that everyone seeks to emulate. So wouldn't that be great for Bhutan to do that? But they don't. But we do. And there's global costs and impact.
There is. Yes.
So it's not as, to me, it's not as benign. I get the human vulnerability and I get the compassion at that level, but it's hard for me to carry it to where those practices individually line up to a collective impact.
Yes. So the practice here isn't to say, and now what political action are we going to take to remedy the situation, but what quality of heart am I going to come to solutions with? It's not saying we're going to be passive and there's no solutions. Ultimately, there's both in yoga there is a social justice component, and in certain aspects of Buddhism there's a social justice component, like the bodhisattva who resists awakening to complete enlightenment until he or she can help all beings awaken. That person is preserving their need to stay amongst the other suffering humans so we can all awaken. So the question isn't, now what's my strategy going to be, but what kind of heart will I bring to that strategy? How am I going to talk to people who are lost in greed and envy about what they're doing to the planet, both to the human experience on the planet and its environmental, ecological experience? If I come to them with cruelty and rage, I probably won't get very far.
It's hard not to come. I can get those. It's the non-cringing. I think that's the one I really like. Because inside it feels so...
Yeah.
Like it's heartbreak.
It is. So here's an experiment you could run because you travel a lot.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're probably on an airplane sitting next to someone with whom you might not resonate.
Yes.
And yet, let's say you have a long flight. You're going to be on this plane for a while with this person. In fact, I can give you an even better story in just a moment, but let's say that that person becomes the person you're going to be practicing with. As they're sitting that near to you, can you practice relaxing the cringe to see what happens to your own nervous system in relationship to this individual? Now let's imagine that before you got on the plane, you were both up at the ticket counter, and you were having some kind of argument or dynamic, each of you with the ticket agent. And you saw that this person's way of doing it was very outside of your own scope, your personal ethic or values. And yours was very kind and compassionate and understanding of the ticket agent and so on. And you saw this dynamic here and you're thinking, oh my God, I don't want to sit next to that. And then you get on the plane and that's your neighbor. Now, if you had said something to that person in the line to cause them to feel, let's say, more embarrassed or more exposed or more angry or more outraged, that now you're telling them how to talk to the ticket agent because what they're doing is inappropriate, then you're going to sit next to them on the airplane. How is that going to be? One of you is going to feel mortified. Maybe both. So in other words, I'm pointing to, if we get into the circumstance where we're going to cause more shame and ignorance, we aren't going to be able to help. You're welcome. Yeah.
Sorry, Joy.
Yes.
And I think at the end of the day, even though I totally agree, I agree with the close and far, but the attachment piece is the big part, because we don't do this to practice it for an outcome. I mean, that's the major thing. We do it because it's the right thing to do, and if enough of us do it, hopefully there's a shift that occurs. And that's so tricky, because I think we all are very married to an outcome for ourselves and whoever else around us. And
yes, and we only have
culture we are, and so I think that's where it gets tricky for me, for sure. And then reminding myself, one of the things that was helpful with loving kindness and compassion for myself, for the things that I don't feel good about, is that other people are going along as best they can as well, and I may find it very offensive, but they have a right to live their lives the way they want to live them, just like I do. You know, not that I'm not going to call people or have expectations or whatever, but if I can't, there's certain places I can't do anything about it. They're going to make a mess of things if that's what they choose. And
well, the question to ask ourselves, which I'll ask you now, and then we'll sit quietly with this question. The question to ask really fundamentally is, if I'm a person who wants to be a conduit or an agent for social change, if I'm a person who would want to be an ambassador of compassion or loving kindness, what is the expense to my vitality when I'm living in the cringe or the judgment or the attachment or the pity? What is the cost to my vital resources, which I need to keep that conduit available? The expense is to me, and may not even get noticed by the other. And that vital expression of you is precious, and since it's relatively rare, here in this country anyhow, as Nancy was pointing out, since it's relatively rare, we need to cherish it. We need to protect and nourish that vital resource. It is your compassionate heart. So less time with the cringe or the attachment or the comparison or aversion. So in the spirit of that, let's sit quietly with just a real sense of the preciousness of that vital energy that is you, and that you can cherish, you can wisely cherish. So you can sit in a comfortable manner for yourself. To feel that vitality that is precious in you, notice the experience you have of the breath entering and exiting your nose. Or the feeling in your fingers and thumbs, if you're able to sense your heartbeat there. And you might ask yourself, how will I tonight, after leaving this discussion, how will I most honor my vitality? How am I going to most cherish this resource that can sustain my native heart? And with a commitment to that, you may join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.